night in the Solomon Islands was not black. It was thicker than black, a suffocating liquid darkness that swallowed the horizon without mercy. Inside the Combat Information Center of an American destroyer in late 1942, the air tasted like sweat, metal, and headphone static. Men spoke in whispers not because silence was required, but because the moment demanded it. A green phosphor sweep rotated on the small circular radar screen. Still new technology for this kind of night surface hunting, but already becoming the closest thing these men had to supernatural sight. A faint return appeared. Thin, barely there. Heading southeast fast, no one said it out loud yet. But every man in that compartment already knew what that bearing meant. The Tokyo Express. Long, lean Japanese destroyers transporting men, shells, supplies, and death through this ink-black corridor of ocean. Before Guadalcanal, the Japanese were the hunters at night, and Americans were the ones who got ambushed. But tonight, Americans had radar, and a score to settle. Men leaned closer to the screen, hands tightened on scopes and plotting boards, because this was the moment when the mentality quietly flipped. And this is where the deeper story begins, the world that made American destroyers treat these meetings like personal vendettas. The ocean battlefield around Guadalcanal in the second half of 1942 was unlike anything the United States Navy had ever experienced. It was not a carrier war here, not a giant fleet line of battle, not even a duel of guns. This was an island chain knife fight. The Imperial Japanese Navy controlled the night. They were faster. Their destroyers were more aggressively handled. They had tremendously experienced night fighting crews, trained in the interwar period for exact conditions like these, and they possessed the most lethal surface naval weapon of that era, the Type 93 oxygen-fueled long-lance torpedo. No, Allied torpedo fired from surface ships in 1942 even existed in the same universe of range. Speed, explosive yield, or reliability. This is important, because it explains something most casual observers never understand. The Pacific Surface War in 1942 was a Japanese night torpedo ambush culture, and Americans were the prey. That is not hyperbole. At Savo Island alone, on the night of August 8 to 9, 1942, 4 Allied cruisers were smashed and sunk in a shockingly short period in darkness by Japanese ships that Americans didn't even visually detect before the water turned into a flaming charnel house. That trauma stayed. American destroyer. Sailors talked about it later with a unique combination of rage and shame. But it was not just Savo. Every single run of the Tokyo Express down the slot toward Guadalcanal became a psychological attack on the Americans holding that island. These were not random cargo ships. These were some of the most highly trained destroyer units in the world, running at night, running fast, dropping troops and shells, then vanishing before the sun could punish them. The Japanese officers believed correctly that they owned the night. They believed that American surface forces were disorganized, slow to react, blinded and clumsy. And frankly, in mid-1942, that was not far from reality. American destroyer formations lacked standardized night tactics. They lacked hard doctrine for aggressive night surface action. They lacked confidence because confidence comes only from repeated success in identical conditions. And the Tokyo Express kept winning those nightly tests. It was not just a naval defeat. It was a humbling educational beating. American destroyers were being taught what a modern night surface battle was by the enemy at the cost of blood, ships, and humiliation. But something else happened in those months. While Japanese officers believed they were proving their superiority, they were also revealing their system, their speed, their typical ingress routes, their normal mission cycles, their usual timings, their preferred exits, their torpedo envelopes. The Americans were losing ships, but they were collecting something just as dangerous. Pattern knowledge destroyer officers began quietly keeping notebooks on this. They began reading after action, reports with the obsessive intensity of gamblers memorizing card sequences. Some U.S. destroyer skippers had lost friends in these night attacks. Some had picked survivors out of oil-slicked water. Some had watched wounded men die in their arms. And that kind of experience had a predictable effect. The desire to return the pain. This is where the seeds of personal vendetta were planted. It did not come from propaganda. It did not come from speeches. It came from the water and the wrecks and the burned hands of men pulling other men from the sea. The longer Americans held Guadalcanal, the more they understood something fundamental. The Japanese were not ghosts. They were not gods of night fighting. They were men with routines, doctrines, and patterns can be tracked. Patterns can be hunted. By the end of 1942, America still did not yet have the tactical upper hand at night. But the psychological posture had changed. Instead of being terrified of Japanese destroyers at night young, American destroyer officers now wanted to meet them. They wanted to close the distance. They wanted to use radar not as a shield but as a blade. That is the exact moment where this transformation begins. A slow, quiet turning inside the minds of American destroyer captains, from hiding under cover of darkness to seeking contact inside it, because radar gave Americans something the Japanese could not defeat with pure seamanship. It gave them vision, and that vision would slowly evolve into weaponized intent. By early 1943, the war in the Solomons shifted from shock to adaptation. American destroyer officers had lived enough nights under that black ceiling of sky to now understand their true enemy was not the Japanese sailor. It was Japanese predictability. Tokyo Express destroyers had to run specific lanes. They had to beat dawn. They had to arrive with enough time to unload, shell, and escape. Suddenly, the Japanese Navy was not a mystery anymore. They were a timetable, and the United States Navy was the world's greatest timetable killer. But the real breakthrough was not aggression. It was the quiet merging of three things: new radar sets, new doctrine, new leadership culture inside the destroyer force. Radar was not just better eyes. It was a different kind of decision-making speed. A Japanese officer needed perfect optical observation, star shell illumination, deck discipline, and bridge teamwork to get an accurate night picture. An American radar plot needed one sweep of electrons and a pencil. This is the true divide, not bravery, not patriotism, data speed. And this is where captains like Arleigh Burke and Frederick Moosbrugger represent not just names but archetypes. They became symbols of the new breed. Destroyer leaders who treated radar not as a defensive warning instrument, but as an offensive trigger signal. Moosbrugger proved the doctrine at Vella Gulf in August 1943, a night ambush so clean and lethal that the Japanese were stunned at how easily their destroyers evaporated under radar-controlled American torpedoes. That battle was the line in the sand before Vella Gulf. Americans feared Japanese torpedoes. After the Vella Gulf, Americans used the same principles against them. Destroyer squadron commanders began building personal kill sheets. They studied enemy silhouettes until they could recognize hulls in seconds. They memorized Japanese torpedo arcs. They internalized Japanese reload cycles. And they began taking Japanese destroyers the way a professional hunter takes apex predators patiently, coldly, without emotion. By late 1943, the Japanese Navy did not fully realize it yet, but they were no longer being challenged at night. They were being stalked. Their old advantage had been turned against them, because the Americans now understood something the Imperial Navy could not accept. Once radar plus doctrine plus individual aggressive captains aligned, the Americans could choose when to kill. Japanese reports later described a phenomenon they struggled to fully define at the time. They said it felt like the Americans were waiting in the night with knowledge of their movement routes. They said it felt like Americans were hunting with personal emotion. Some of them were. They said it felt like American destroyers treated each contact as a personal score. By 1944, that feeling would become undeniable. That is why Guadalcanal is not just a battle in the timeline. It is the crucible where American destroyer culture shifted from frightened rookies into controlled night killers armed with the first true sensor advantage in naval surface history. And this evolution would not stay locked in the Solomons. It would travel outward, northwest, toward the Philippines, toward the Central Pacific, toward the fleet battles where Japanese officers for the first time would say openly, "The Americans are choosing the moment of battle, not us." And that is the doorway into the next layer of this story, when the psychology breaks through the hull and becomes the center of the war narrative itself. Because to understand how Vendetta entered the destroyer war, you must now see the human and emotional angles inside that change. There is a belief in naval history that ships fight wars. That is false. Men fight wars. Ships are only the tools they choose, and in the Pacific Destroyer War of 42-43, this is where the American transformation became deeply human, because American destroyer officers were not blank machines following doctrine. Many had lost friends. Many had pulled dying men out of oil fires. Many had watched sailors crushed against bulkheads when torpedo shock waves tore through their hulls. Not in loud words, but in a silent change in posture. They no longer waited to see what Japanese destroyers would do. They hunted the lanes they knew the Japanese must run. This is the second angle. Doctrine fused with emotion. Normally, doctrine is sterile. Tactical manuals do not contain anger, but experiences of defeat do something to human beings. It is the same in boxing. The fighter who is knocked down hard will either break or train until his body becomes a weapon designed to answer that humiliation. American destroyer skippers answered. They trained radar tracking crews to be faster. They drilled torpedo salvos designed not to warn, but to kill outright from the first engagement. This is uncomfortable to admit, but it is historically real. American destroyermen began fighting at night not to survive, but to close distance and end the other destroyer's life. This leads to the third angle. Technological superiority becomes a moral pivot. Once the Americans realized that radar let them see before being seen, it changed the psychology of the fight. This is where the Japanese perspective becomes important. Japanese officers did not know how radar worked. They understood the concept, but they did not understand the decisive timeline advantage it gave. They did not realize that the Americans had the first true night first-mover advantage in naval history. Thus, when American destroyers began showing up in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment and killing with terrifying efficiency, Japanese officers interpreted it emotionally. They thought the Americans wanted them, not tactically. Personally, and from their perspective that was true, because for the men in those CIC rooms in 1943, it was personal. You cannot pull bodies from water and remain purely mechanical. You cannot see shattered hull plates and smashed gun mounts and call it just numbers. This is where the destroyer war diverges from carrier warfare. Carrier warfare is abstract. It is numbers, fuel, coordinates. Destroyer warfare is face-to-face at the range of rifle fire. Destroyer warfare is men staring at glowing scopes, knowing another set of men out there are staring back but blind, and that blindness that American knew overmatch in the dark felt like power. Japanese officers later said this was when they realized the Americans were not just reacting to Japanese night attacks. The Americans were coming for them. And that is the bridge into the next angle. The Japanese internal realization that American destroyers now wanted night battles more than the Japanese did. Japanese officers in 1942 had believed something almost sacred. They believed that night belonged to them. They believed that the ocean darkness was their domain, the arena of the Imperial Navy's highest mastery. They believed Americans feared it. For months, this belief had been reinforced every night the Tokyo Express ran down the slot. Every time a Japanese destroyer vanished into the darkness like a blade into a sheath, and every time an American ship exploded under a long lance torpedo before even seeing who fired it. So when the Americans began showing up in the night at the exact time and place where Japanese destroyers were running, the Japanese mind did not interpret this as U.S. has new sensors. They interpreted it as Americans have become like us, but worse. And this is the first angle from the Japanese side. They misdiagnosed the American transformation. They believed it was aggression. They thought it was rage. They thought it was revenge. But it was actually pattern mastery. American destroyermen did not suddenly become better sailors overnight. They became analysts who learned the Tokyo Express timetable so precisely that they could sit in the darkness and wait like fishermen who know exactly when the predator fish will breach the surface. The Japanese did not understand that radar was giving Americans the ability to detect changes in bearing and speed instantly, so Japanese evasive tactics became ineffective. This leads to the second Japanese side angle. The loss of mystery is the loss of power. In 1942, the Japanese night destroyer was a ghost. By mid-1943, it was a track on a radar plot. The moment the Americans could track range, course, speed, and bearing of a target in total darkness, Japanese night surface magic ceased to be magic. It became mathematics, and mathematics is merciless. Once the Japanese realized Americans were attacking not out of desperation but out of cold, timed calculation, their morale dynamic shifted. They began to feel hunted. This leads to the third angle. The hunted begin to sense that the hunter enjoys the killing because some American destroyer squadrons did. Not emotionally chaotic enjoyment, not sadism, but the satisfaction of professional execution. There is a specific, chilling kind of confidence that enters a destroyer captain's voice when he knows he has a firing solution on a blind enemy in the dark. Men described these moments: the quiet order, the stillness of the CIC, and then the simple command, fire. There is no shouting at that moment, no dramatic gesture, no Hollywood roar. It is the most calm moment in the world, because the work is already done. You are simply pressing the button. This is what Japanese officers began to sense: the Americans were not just countering them anymore. The Americans were practicing the hunt. And that final psychological inversion is the most important angle. Of all Japanese destroyer officers, slowly realized that the Americans' new night doctrine was built around deliberate psychological payback. Not publicly, not as policy, not as propaganda, but quietly, ship by ship, commander by commander. By the time this transformation was complete, the Japanese had a new fear, not merely that Americans could kill them at night, but that Americans wanted to. And that is the emotional bridge that carries us into the heart of this story, the moment of total inversion when American destroyers did not simply intercept Japanese destroyers. They hunted them deliberately, with full situational control, and broke the old order of the night. The turning point was not a single battle, it was an entire season. By now, American destroyer culture had fully converted from defense against Japanese night raiders into offensive night ambush craft, and the Japanese were walking directly into it. Because they could not stop running ships at night, the Empire needed those lanes, those resupply routes, those troop runs. They could not just give up the ocean, and Americans knew it. So American destroyer squadrons began to do something deeply cold. They lied in wait, not in the general vicinity, not on patrol lines. They hid directly in the mathematical intersection points where Japanese destroyers must pass the only geography that allowed their routes to function. It was not a chase. It was not a pursuit. It was a trap. And the Japanese never fully understood the degree to which the Americans could predict them. There is a phrase surface warfare officers use even today. Positional warfare is psychological warfare. Whoever chooses where the fight will happen chooses how that fight will feel. In 1942, the Japanese chose. In 1944, the Americans chose. And here is the single most important tactical inversion. Americans were firing first. That never happened in 1942, not once. But now Americans were launching torpedoes before Japanese destroyers even suspected contact, and when the torpedoes hit the CIC rooms on American ships did not celebrate. They simply shifted to the next track. Because the transformation was complete. This was not a boxing match anymore, this was processing. In several 1944 engagements like the Battle of Surigao Straits destroyer actions, American destroyers coordinated night attacks so precisely that multiple Japanese units reported the same surreal experience. They were being hit by ships they could not find. Not could not see, could not find it. And this is where the personal vendetta myth becomes real. Some American destroyer COs carried lists of lost ships, lists of friends killed, lists of hull names that never came home from Guadalcanal. And when intelligence briefings predicted which Japanese destroyer divisions were expected in the coming night lanes, these American officers knew the hull numbers of the enemy by memory. There are documented cases where individual U.S. skippers asked if a particular Japanese destroyer by name was expected in the lane that night. You cannot get more personal than that. This was not a faceless war. These men remembered which Japanese ships put their friends in the water. And so in 1944 and early 1945, the nightmare the Japanese had built for Americans in 1942 returned to them. Only now the Americans had modern tools, deeper magazines, better training, superior intelligence, and fully integrated radar-driven fire control. The hunter had become the hunted. This is the moment when Japanese officers began writing post-war memoir lines about the terrifying confidence of American destroyers, the way they would appear exactly where the Japanese were most vulnerable. They thought it was hatred. It was actually precision. The Americans did not have to search anymore. They knew. And this is the moment, this 1944 apex, that leads directly into the most shattering emotional layer of all. When Japanese surviving officers realized this was not just tactical victory, it was the flipping of the psychological universe that once defined the Pacific night. There is a specific Japanese phrase that appears quietly in post-war destroyer officer interviews regarding late-war night engagements. We became the rabbits. In Japanese culture, this metaphor is extremely revealing. The rabbit is not just prey. It is prey that is pursued, not ambushed, not accidentally discovered. Hunted. By 1945, surviving Japanese destroyers were experiencing something their navy had never psychologically prepared for. They were being attacked by an enemy who knew where they were going, when they would arrive, what escape corridors they would use. There was no mystery anymore, and Japanese night tactical identity, that cultural naval inheritance, was shattered in that realization. The Long Lance was still technically deadly. The Japanese crews were still individually superb. Their seamanship was still disciplined. But none of that matters if the enemy sees you first. None of that matters if the enemy fires first. None of that matters if the enemy is there because he knew you would come through that pass at that hour. One Japanese officer described a night action like this. We moved unseen without the moon. Yet the Americans were already there, waiting. This was not a battle. This was punishment. That sentence is the essence. By 1945, American destroyers radiated a specific energy. We are here to erase you, not because of race, not because of ideology, but because the destroyer war is a duelist war. Destroyers are not built to fight at range. They are built to fight in the knife range of the sea, and knife fights carry emotional memories. Carrier pilots never see the men they kill. Battleship gunners never see the eyes of the men inside the hull they hit. Destroyermen know it as men, not machines. When a destroyer captain presses fire on a night torpedo spread, he knows exactly what is on the other end. Men like him. That is why the destroyer war was the most personal naval war of the Pacific. And that is why when 1945 finally arrived, the surviving Japanese officers looked at the Americans with a strange, tragic respect, because the Americans had learned the same dark art of the night and then surpassed the original masters. This is the moment the myth died. No one in the Imperial Navy could claim night superiority anymore. Their destroyers could no longer operate unseen through the black water. They could no longer control the rhythm of engagement. They could no longer dictate when combat would begin. The Americans owned the timeline now, and when you own the timeline, you own fear. This is the climax. This is the single moment where the psychological balance of the entire Pacific Night War inverted. And when Japan's night destroyer veterans looked back after the war, this was the memory that hurt the most, not the losses, but the realization that the Americans, these same men they had once mocked as clumsy daylight amateurs, now hunted them on the exact night they believed belonged to Japan. And that realization leads into the bitter question history then had to answer. When the war finally ended in August 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy destroyer force was essentially annihilated. The Tokyo Express, the symbol of their night dominion in 1942, had become a cemetery of hull numbers. No weapon they had ever mastered could survive the combination that had finally broken them. Radar code breaking and intelligence, American positional, doctrine industrial sustainment. The Japanese could not replace ships at anywhere near the rate the United States could build and repair destroyers. They could not train destroyer crews fast enough to fill the loss gaps. They could not re-equip shattered divisions with radar or electronic warfare that could match American night detection. So the attrition became reality. In late-war statistical analysis, surviving Japanese officers admitted that they no longer believed night could save them. They no longer believed surprise belonged to them. They no longer believed speed could compensate for being seen. This is the bitter, fundamental lesson of this entire narrative. Once a technology that changes tempo enters war tradition is instantly irrelevant. Japan has a tradition. Japan had skill. Japan had the boldest destroyer tactics of any navy in the world in 1942, but America had the thing that destroys all tradition: a better clock. This is the most powerful, unspoken truth of the Pacific surface. War victory did not go to the navy that wanted it more. It went to the navy that could decide when the fight would begin. When a navy can choose time, it has its own outcome. And because American destroyers could choose time by 1944-45, the Japanese night destroyer culture simply ceased to exist. Americans did not eclipse the Japanese. Americans replaced the very domain in which the Japanese once thrived, and this is why Japanese post-war officers used the rabbit metaphor. They were no longer predators. They were no longer fighters of night duels. They were prey inside corridors they once believed were sanctuaries. The personal vendettas that American destroyermen carried through 1943-44 were never formally written into doctrine. They were never policy. They were not encouraged by official naval leadership in any documented directive. But they existed. They existed in the hearts of men who had watched the bloodwater off Guadalcanal's coastline. Men who had listened to the screams of burning fuel. Men who had stood in CIC rooms staring at radar echo returns that represented the same class of ships that had killed their friends. And those personal emotions fused with radar and doctrine reshaped the Pacific Night War. This is not a theory. This is the aftermath reality. America's destroyer force emerged from the Solomons as a fundamentally different breed. A group of officers and crews who had learned to kill in the dark with precision and timing that no navy in human history had yet achieved. And this raises the final question. What did this transformation cost the Americans themselves? America won the Destroyer Night War, but the men who fought it did not walk away untouched. The U.S. Navy destroyer men who survived 1942-45 did not celebrate victory like carrier pilots did. They did not carry the same triumph psychological posture that bomber crews carried. Destroyer crews walked away quieter, because they knew exactly what they had done. Destroyer combat is personal. It is intimate violence. It happens close enough that radio intercepts catch human panic. Close enough that when a torpedo impact breaks a hull, the blast is not abstract. It is a room, a compartment, a steel corridor where 100 men instantly die. Destroyer captains do not forget this. They can tell you the time of every engagement, the bearing of every first detection, the number of torpedoes fired, the radar range of every first contact. This is not like dropping a 1,000-pound bomb from 12,000 feet. This is two knife fighters in an alley, and one of them simply sees the other first. That is why post-war U.S. destroyer culture carries a strange emotional undertone. There is pride in mastery, yes. There is pride in the fact that they became better hunters than the original hunters, but there is also the quiet knowledge. We became exactly what we feared. Because when the survivors of the Solomons destroyer campaign were interviewed decades later, many admitted something in common. They never forgot the faces of the Japanese sailors they saw in brief flashes through binocular glass, or in the moment a burning ship rolled and briefly illuminated its bridge. This is the psychological bill of the destroyer war. Japan's night destroyer elite, the greatest night surface warriors of 1942, died believing they had become prey. America's night destroyer elite, the greatest hunters of 1945, lived the rest of their lives understanding that hunting in the dark leaves a stain. Ask any destroyer captain any era. The sea is not an abstract battlefield. It is a personal combat arena. Carrier pilots kill formations, submarines kill tonnage, battleships kill from the horizon, destroyers kill individuals, which brings us to the final impact. The lessons of this war during this night destroyer duel in the Pacific did not disappear. They became the foundation of post-war U.S. naval doctrine. Control the timeline, own the detection domain, strike first at night. That doctrine reaches all the way to modern Aegis destroyers. The ghosts of Iron Bottom Sound still whisper into the circuitry of spy radar arrays today. And this is why the climax of this story matters. Because the destroyer war of the Pacific tells us something eternal about war. If you master the night, you master fear. And if you master fear, you own the outcome.